The Real AI Podcast with Michael Hainsworth is brought to you by Microsoft.
Many great advances in technology we use every day got their start as enabling technologies for people with disabilities. The typewriter was first built in 1808 to help the blind lover of an Italian inventor. Closed captioning on that TV in a noisy bar was created in 1971 to help the hearing impaired. And we routinely dictate text messages on our phones using voice recognition, thanks to advances made in the mid-1980s. Today, Real AI is helping level the playing field as well. None of this is news to Dave Dame, though. When I spoke to the head of accessibility at Microsoft, he told me that when he was born in 1971, the doctors delivered some bad news. He had cerebral palsy.
I also told my parents, with Dave being born with cerebral palsy, he may not live past 12. He may not ever be able to speak clearly, if at all. And even if he does, don't expect much, because there's not much in the world that somebody with cerebral palsy could do. And they actually advised my parents to put me in an institution. And to be fair, in 1971, that was the status quo for people with physical disabilities.
There was a solution to those with physical disabilities. It's often said that technology is an enabler for those who are with those disabilities. And once that technology gets improved upon and iterated upon, the rest of the world gets to see it. What did you think when you discovered your first PC?
It was interesting. When I got my first PC, I was a nerdy kid. It wasn't because I had a disability. It was because I was a nerdy kid. And what I liked about the computer was I could create a world that was accessible. I could build something that I could be included in. Because with technology, we didn't have the constraints of the physical, limited real world. We could artificially create through code a world that didn't even know what disability was. And it could be built with, inclusiveness in mind and no limitations.
Technology is sort of a leveler of a mismatch in any given environment. It's not the cerebral palsy that's holding you back. I can imagine back through the 80s and 90s, it was that lack of technology.
Well, it was a lack of technology for sure, and an environment. Technology provided the virtual and digital ramps I needed to really give me the career that I have and the opportunities I have. If I would have been born in any previous era with a disability, there'd be very limited I could do in things as simple as capturing notes, doing math or spreadsheets. So being exposed to computers at an early age as a kid really gave me the competitive advantage because I got to get a head start of learning technology than most other people had to, which really prepared me in the real world when I got my first job, when none of my other colleagues never experienced a computer.
What's your biggest frustration with technology today? It has come so far, but it still has so far to go.
My frustration with technology today is ableism bias, right? As they're building more and more technology with complex gestures and complex ways of navigating the computer. It's almost like a tease, right? Technology was the thing that enabled me, and as we make it for the masses, when it's not done right, it becomes an exclusionary tool, which, it's harder when you have something taken away from you once you have it. So I think sometimes the speed of the evolution of innovation and technology sometimes can come out of fear of taking away what I had, and I have to wait for the next version before I can reclaim what I previously was able to do.
I can imagine you see a lot of that kind of stuff, or you saw a lot of that kind of stuff in your very first job. The types of things that able-bodied people could do in a certain length of time hadn't been adapted to accommodate for you.
Well, even better yet, Michael, when I got my first job, even though I had a university degree in computer science and stuff, my first job was a logistical training coordinator, where it was a lot of paperwork and a lot of physical things that required these hands to manipulate papers and folders. And as you can imagine, that wasn't my strong point for sure. And It really took me 12 hours to what the rest of my peers could do in 8 hours. And then luckily they dropped the first computer on my desk. So in the hopes of being able to get home at the same time as everyone else, the internet just came out because it was 1995, was starting to get a wider presence. So I built a website where people could self-sign up for the training courses, and a lot of our logistics vendors that would host those training events could schedule them online. So what was taking me 12 hours a day, I was able to drop down to 3 hours a day. I was like, who's the person with a disability now? And then because it was a mismatch for me early, by me fixing it, it made everybody else that thought 8 hours was the appropriate amount of time. They became the mismatch and they got to leverage that technology so we could all get our work done at 3. So where my mismatch was, I used to believe was a disadvantage, I turned it into my career, which was to be a change agent to really reduce mismatches because I was so used to having to find unique creative ways to minimize those mismatches.
And so, as a technology geek yourself, you've referred to technology as the key enabler. Let's get into that. Define what that means to you.
Technology can help make things easier in a way of automating things that, for me to type one sentence, it's almost the same effort as typing pages of documents. So technology being able to utilize my other senses, like voice to text, allows me to use what I have better control over to minimize what I don't have control over. And really give me the ability to communicate, especially when the doctor said I may never be able to speak clearly, if at all. Being able to speak is allowing me to write, create, and then if you overlay the internet, it's given me a global voice where I can connect and inspire and really influence many through technology, where if I didn't have technology, Michael, I'd be limited to the confines of my home office.
So I said earlier that features originally intended to become accessibility features end up becoming commonplace technologies for the able as well as those with disabilities. Do you agree with that assessment?
Oh, absolutely. And we can just look at as recently as closed captioning, right? Closed captioning was originally made for the hearing impaired. But then if you take a step back, Michael, and look at it, there are certain times in our life where we all have hearing difficulties. Imagine if we're at a loud bar trying to watch the game on TV or watch anything on TV. Now we can watch the closed captioning to be able to really compensate for that mismatch of not having a quiet environment to take in the TV program. Imagine when we use video calls like this, now we can have captioning. And if we add something like a language filter on it, we can turn it to our native languages, even if we don't speak a common language very well, and have great communication. And if you look at home assistants today, right, we all have Google or any of those other things. That was originally made for people with disabilities to control their environment. It turns out, because I can't get out of a wheelchair, we shouldn't exclude people that don't want to get out of their chair to turn on the lights, adjust the thermostat, and things like that. So if you read the World Health Organization, there's going to be $2 billion set aside for AT innovation because they're leveraging it for technologies like that. So really, there's a lot of technology innovation potential that starts out with assistive technology, because what better way to see a mismatch than somebody that's permanently in that mismatch, and then look at how do we apply that individual mismatch to situational mismatches or even to aging, right? Because I always like to say we're all going to be disabled one day. just some of us beat you to it.
So with that in mind, you mentioned closed captioning, that kind of stuff. You point out that on video calls, they can now be done on the fly using speech-to-text capabilities. And then, of course, there are those types of tech.
AI.
Well, that's where I'm going. Artificial intelligence. It seems to be a key enabling technology. What are the three key uses you see for artificial intelligence for accessibility?
You know, the real interesting thing, everybody looks at AI to solve complex problems, right? That's why we like AI, because it's going to reduce the complexity. There is so much low-hanging fruit when it comes to being a person with a disability or a mismatch, because the things that seem the most easiest and trivial to you, Michael, is complex for me. So if we can use it for things like text-to-speech, when that first came out before AI, it wasn't a pleasant experience at all. And now with AI being able to learn the way I speak and the subtleties, that's great. But what a good potential will be is the real challenge with voice to text is the way we talk is different than how we write. So when I use verbal communication to go into written communication, there's still a lot of manual editing I need to do to make sure it's in written format. I think AI has the opportunity to be able to give me options and convert that to make life a lot easier. AI has a lot of opportunity. What I enjoy most is on LinkedIn, when people message you, AI learns how you usually respond to certain questions. I can just click a button. Now that might seem trivial. That might seem, that's not really cutting edge innovation. But that low-hanging fruit allows me to quickly collaborate and ideate with somebody with fewer keystrokes or using verbal communication, or even autocomplete as we type. As you learn the way I write, you know what I'm going to say. Because I imagine, Michael, if you look at about 30 emails you've done with hosts, I bet you there's a lot of very similar vernacular that an AI system could learn where you wouldn't have to reduce it or even cut and paste. It would pick up where you were going and fill it in and give you an option. Do you want to complete it like this? Those little trivial things that seem trivial to you make the world better for somebody where the most trivial thing is complex.
We recognize that big data that goes into all of these machine learning algorithms and artificial intelligence and systems, that for big data to be complete, the autocomplete system is taking all of your emails and text messages that we send at any given moment, putting it all into a bin to figure out what it is that we really want to say in as few keystrokes as possible. But when it comes to big data that goes into other AI, it's often inherently biased. It needs to be audited. It needs to be cleaned. What are some of the biases in large data sets that come with addressing accessibility?
They almost make all the mismatches because they don't see it differently. I know when I was partnering on the board with something, when the camera saw me in the wheelchair, the AI translated it to a baby in a carriage because that was the closest match it had for my head and that height. So now that we actually got to go through an exercise of the data set to make sure every type of user is represented in it, it really gives us a chance to step back and realize the importance of the uniqueness and differences before we put that in the machine, and maybe make us more aware of our own individual biases that we realized we didn't have. So there's always usually a lot of biases, but it's also an opportunity to repaint the landscape by knowing this bias has existed before. Now we're aware of it in the AI because, like you said, we keep hearing about the dangers of data sets overgeneralizing and things like that. This is a good opportunity to redo something better than we did previously to AI.
If you had to describe in one word your feelings about the role AI is going to play in accessibility in the future, what would that one word be?
Optimistic. Optimistic because I believe it's going to make a better world.
Dave, this has been fabulous. Thank you for your time and insight.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
Real AI will continue to level the playing field for people like Dave and others. It's being used in education to expand access to learning materials and language development. Machine learning is helping solve unemployment challenges. And because a disability can affect any of us at any time, AI is being used to make the house a smarter home. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to the Real AI Podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe today and visit Microsoft.com/AI to see exciting real-world examples of real AI in use today.